Ladies and gentlemen, in a world fixated on gratification, to withhold is to rebel. To contain what is often squandered is to ignite a silent war, not only with others but within oneself. I speak not merely of a physical act, but of an inner revolution. When a man chooses to retain his semen, he is not just abstaining, he is redirecting. What once flowed outward now ascends. This energy, ancient, potent, and often misunderstood, rises into new realms: thought, will, vision, and spirit. But this act, noble as it is, does not go unnoticed. He becomes a target. Why? Because the one who refuses to spill his essence stands outside the tribe of the unconscious. He walks a narrow path of individuation, while others drift in the tides of instinct. And when a man begins to master himself, he becomes a mirror to those who have not. That reflection is unbearable. Mockery, suspicion, even hostility follow. Not because he is wronged, but because he has changed. The collective psyche, threatened by transformation, lashes out. It demands conformity. And the one who retains becomes a disruption, an unspoken accusation against the indulgent. This journey is not for the faint. Retention awakens not only power, but the shadow, both within and without. It confronts the man with his fears, his suppressed desires, and the chaos he once poured away. But if he endures, if he transmutes, he becomes more than man. He becomes whole. You will be targeted, yes. But what is the arrow of judgment to a man wearing the armor of awareness? What is ridicule to a soul no longer enslaved by impulse? So stand firm. Retain not just your seed, but your soul force, and let it carve through you a new path, a path lined with clarity, strength, and purpose. The world may aim at you, but you will have already pierced deeper truths. And in that, you are no victim. You are the alchemist. Thank you. To retain semen is to engage in a profound act of inner conservation, one that speaks not only to discipline, but to the redirection of the libido, the life force energy that underpins all psychic activity. In the language of depth psychology, libido is not confined to sexual desire. It is the raw current of vitality that animates the psyche, fuels imagination, drives ambition, and shapes the will to create, to become, to transcend. Ordinarily, this energy flows outward, seeking expression through the body, through instinct, through physical pleasure. But when a man chooses to hold it within, not through repression, but through conscious containment, he begins to forge a new relationship with his own psyche. The libido, denied its usual outlet, does not vanish. Instead, it begins to metamorphose. This metamorphosis is both sacred and dangerous. The energy turns inward and moves through symbolic channels. It may awaken images, dreams, visions, or sudden creative compulsions. Desires that were once purely physical begin to alchemize into something more subtle: insight, intuition, clarity. The inner world becomes vivid, almost unbearable in its intensity, because the man is now communing directly with his psychic depths rather than dispersing them. This is not simply a matter of abstinence, but of psychic economy. A man who retains his semen is effectively saying, "I will not waste my fire." And in doing so, he begins to sense the enormity of what he holds. He is no longer merely a biological being responding to external stimuli, but a vessel for concentrated force. That force, when harnessed, becomes the crucible of transformation. But this containment also carries a burden. The energy, now unexpressed in its base form, demands to be sublimated, channeled. If ignored, it can distort the psyche, breed anxiety, or erupt in unconscious behaviors. It is not enough to simply hold, it must be directed. The man must now choose where to send this power: into art, philosophy, work, spiritual development, or the slow construction of an inner world capable of bearing its weight. He begins to see that what the world calls semen is not just fluid, it is symbol. It is the mythic seed, not only of children but of visions, structures, and new selves. To retain it is to plant it in the soil of the soul, rather than spill it on barren ground. And this act, radical in its simplicity, begins the long journey of inner elevation. This is where individuation begins, when the libido no longer leaks into the world unconsciously, but is drawn back into the self, like a river returning to its source. In this, a man reclaims his autonomy, no longer bound to the push and pull of primitive drives. He does not repress, he reclaims. He does not escape desire, he refines it. This refinement marks the beginning of psychic sovereignty, and the moment this process begins, the world around him starts to change, subtly but unmistakably. When a man begins to retain his semen and transmute his libido, He sets in motion a psychic ripple that does not end with himself. The act of inner discipline, though invisible to the eye, radiates an unmistakable presence. He begins to emit a subtle signal, something ancient, something remembered in the unconscious of others but rarely seen in modern life. It is the signal of a man who is no longer governed by his instincts, but governs them. And this is where resistance begins to emerge, not necessarily from external forces of power or oppression, but from the unconscious of those around him. In every human being lies a shadow, that repressed, denied, and unintegrated portion of the psyche where unacceptable desires, fears, and weaknesses dwell. When an individual refuses to indulge in the common pleasures, especially those tied to base instinct, he unwittingly activates the shadow in others. His discipline, his self-command, becomes a mirror, one that reflects what others have long disowned within themselves. The man who retains becomes a symbol, not of superiority, but of potential. He represents what could be and what is not yet realized in others. This is unbearable for the ego that clings to comfort, that justifies indulgence as freedom, that rationalizes weakness as normalcy. In this confrontation, the psyche of the other begins to react, not consciously but instinctively, through ridicule, suspicion, envy, or even aggression. The energy of semen, when held and directed, transforms a man's aura. There is a weight to his presence. People sense it before they understand it. Some are drawn to it, intuitively recognizing something noble, perhaps ancient. But many recoil. They feel threatened, though they cannot name why. They feel exposed, though no accusation has been made. They feel judged, though no words of judgment were spoken. This is the mechanism of projection. The observer, unable to confront his own lack of control, casts his shadow onto the disciplined man. He becomes the villain, the weirdo, the extremist, the zealot, anything to protect the fragile construct of the self still dependent on external gratification. The retainer becomes a psychological target not because of what he has done, but because of what he represents, the buried potential in others that cries out to be acknowledged but is too painful to face. This is especially true in a culture that glorifies instant satisfaction and condemns delay as repression. The retainer, by simply being, exposes the unconscious contract most have made with their instincts. He introduces friction into a smooth system of escape and escape. And systems, both psychological and societal, do not tolerate friction without reaction. Yet this reaction, this targeting, is not purely hostile. It is a psychic invitation in disguise. Those who mock may secretly admire. Those who dismiss may secretly yearn. The targeting is a defense mechanism, yes, but also a call from the deeper layers of the collective unconscious, which recognizes that the man who holds his seed may also hold a key to something long forgotten. The man who chooses to retain his semen steps beyond more than just personal habit. He steps beyond the invisible boundaries of the collective in a society that thrives on stimulation, distraction, and the externalization of all energy. Such a man becomes an anomaly. He is no longer plugged into the same circuits of consumption and gratification that bind the masses. His energy begins to move vertically rather than horizontally, no longer dispersed across endless indulgence, but rising toward interior development. And this movement is threatening to the collective psyche. The collective does not exist merely as a group of individuals. It exists as a psychic organism, a shared field of beliefs, assumptions, habits, and rituals that give people a sense of belonging and identity. Most remain unconsciously embedded in this field, never questioning its currents, never resisting its suggestions. The man who begins to separate from this field, even silently, even inwardly, is immediately felt as a disturbance. To retain semen is to withdraw psychic energy from the collective matrix of indulgence. It is to say, I will not give my life force to the machinery of decay. And the moment that psychic withdrawal occurs, the system begins to react. Not because it is malevolent, but because it is threatened by differentiation. The collective depends on the predictability of instinctual behavior. It thrives when people are governed by base urges that fuel industries, shape social norms, and keep the deeper self buried beneath layers of appetite. When a man begins to master his impulses, he becomes sovereign, and sovereignty is not welcomed by systems built on compliance. The sovereign man cannot be easily manipulated by sexual imagery, advertising, digital seduction, or ideological noise. He becomes immune to the usual hooks that pull the libido outward into endless distraction. This immunity isolates him, not just socially, but psychically. His very presence becomes dissonant within the collective field. He is no longer dancing to the same drumbeat. He sees through the rituals of excess, the glamour of vice, the subtle worship of weakness. And the collective, sensing this difference, instinctively seeks to bring him back into alignment, not through open persecution, but through more covert mechanisms. Social pressure, mockery, shaming, moral inversion. This resistance operates like an immune system. The collective, like a body, detects what it perceives as a foreign element, something that does not conform to the established code. And just as the body sends white blood cells to isolate and neutralize a threat, the collective sends psychological antibodies in the form of judgment, marginalization, or exclusion. Not because the sovereign man is dangerous in any literal sense, but because his existence exposes the unfreedom of others. Semen retention becomes more than a personal discipline. It becomes a symbolic severance. The man is no longer governed by the same invisible contracts. He is no longer sacrificing his energy at the altar of short-term pleasure. In this refusal, he breaks the spell that binds so many, and in doing so, steps outside the protective veil of collective unconsciousness. Without that veil, he is naked in the storm, but also clear-eyed, rooted in himself rather than the crowd. What unnerves the collective is not his words, but his silence, not his resistance, but his non-participation. He no longer shares in the unspoken rituals of psychic leakage. He no longer pays the toll to be accepted. And when a man no longer seeks belonging at the cost of his essence, he becomes untouchable in a way that the collective both envies and fears.